in its history. We're expanding gallery space, restoring historic features, and upgrading our facilities to greatly improve the visitor experience. We're excited to be collaborating with Diller Scofidio and Renfro on revisioning our exhibition installations to make design stories come alive. We're also working with local projects as our media designer to develop engaging digital content at the museum and online. During the renovation, Cooper-Hewitt is on the move, organizing exhibitions, education programs, and events at off-site locations, such as the graphic design, now in production exhibition on Governor's Island this past summer, our Morse Lecture Series, and Cooper-Hewitt's new Design Center in Harlem. Thanks to Target, our Design Center is offering public programs and a popular series of free activities for families and teens. I hope that some of you will be able to join us next Thursday, December 13th, for a panel discussion on Superstorm Sandy and how design can make a difference in prevention, recovery, and rebuilding efforts. Details about this event and all of our programs can be found on our website. We look forward to a grand reopening of Cooper-Hewitt in 2014 and hope to see you all there. I'm now delighted to introduce Kara McCarty, Curatorial Director at Cooper-Hewitt.
Thank you, Paul. And before I introduce Cheryl Buckley, I want to take a moment to also thank Denny and Lester Morse. If it were not for them, we would not be here this evening. Denny and Lester have been among Cooper-Hewitt's most generous angels and advocates. Not only are they extremely generous donors to the building renovation, exhibitions, and educational programs, but even before we broke ground, they wanted to ensure that our programs and collections kept visible while we were on the move. It was their inspired idea that initiated this marvelous lecture series. And the goal was to invite noted design historians to talk about key design movements, periods, styles, or types that had relevance to our collection. Thank you very much, Denny and Lester. Tonight's topic, Modern Times Design for a New Century, focuses on the 20th century. After introducing Cheryl Buckley, she will introduce the talk and our other two panelists. Cheryl Buckley is professor at Northumbria University, Newcastle upon Tyne, England. The focus of her dissertation was on the 20th century, including fashion and ceramics, with a particular expertise in design, history, and gender. Her dissertation was entitled Women Designers in the North Staffordshire Pottery Industry, 1914 to 1945. And her master's thesis was entitled Isokon Furniture, Architecture, and Graphic Design. Another theme Dr. Buckley's work is transnationalism and the impact of émigré designers in Britain and the United States, about which she has published extensively, including co-editing Transnationalism and Visual Culture in Britain, Émigrés and Migrants, 1933 to 1956, and writing a chapter, Authenticity, Tradition, and Modernity, Marguerite Wildenhain and Ruth Duckworth, Women Émigré Studio Potters, 1936 to 1964. In 1999 to 2000, she worked with Pat Kirkham, contributing to the exhibition at Bard Graduate Center, Women Designers in the USA, 1900 to 2000, Diversity and Difference, for which she wrote an essay in the accompanying catalog entitled Quietly Fine, Quietly Subversive, Women Ceramics Designers in the 20th Century. She is now co-writing a book with Professor Hazel Clark on fashion and everyday life in Britain and America in the 20th century. As you can hear, Dr. Buckley is a prolific author. Among her numerous other publications are Designing Modern Britain, Fashioning the Feminine, Representation in Women's Fashion from the Fin de siècle to the Present Day, and Potters and Paintresses, Women Designers in the British Pottery Industry, 1870 to 1959. She has recently been appointed editorial chair of the Journal of Design History. We are extremely fortunate that Dr. Buckley is a visiting professor in design history at Parsons, the New School for Design, Cooper-Hewitt, National Design Museum. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Buckley.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I hope I can live up to it. Good evening and welcome to Modern Times, Designing a New Century, the third of the... Is that okay? More? Okay. Okay. Well, good evening. Welcome. It's fabulous to be here and to be asked to chair this session, Modern Times, Designing a New Century, the third of the Enid and Lester Morse Historic Design lecture series. I'm delighted to be asked to introduce this and to chair it for a number of reasons. To be able to contribute to the Cooper-Hewitt's programme at this pivotal moment in its history is an honour. At the same time, being a design historian, constantly fascinated by the visual and material cultures that have shaped our world, it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to consider in some detail 4 marvellous examples of design at the Cooper-Hewitt. I'm very fortunate that I'm able to do this in the company of 2 outstanding scholars in the field of design history, Professor Reggie Blazich and Professor Paul Sturton, who I will introduce shortly. Reggie Blazich is an award-winning historian and associate editor of the Journal of Design History. She began her career in Washington, where she spent 11 years as cultural history curator at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. Reggie's scholarship focuses on the history of 20th century design, fashion, business and consumer culture. She's the author of 7 books, including Imagining Consumers, Design and Innovation, From Wedgwood to Corning, which was published in 2000. This received the Hagley Prize for the Best Book in Business History for 2001. Recent publications include Producing Fashion, Commerce, Culture and Consumers from 2008, American Consumer Society, 1865 to 2005, From Hearth to HD TV, from 2009, and The Colour Revolution, which has just come out this last year, 2012. From spring 2013, Reggie takes up a chair in history as Professor of History of Business and Society at the University of Leeds in the UK, where she's going to work on the Marks and Spencer's Company Archive, which opened to the public at the university earlier this year. I'm delighted for Reggie that she's going to be coming to the north of England. This is spoken as a northerner, and I'm looking forward to working with her more closely. Paul Sturton was formerly based in Scotland at the University of Glasgow, but for the last 4 years he's been Associate Professor at the Bard Graduate Centre in New York City, and he's now editor of West 86, the Journal of Decorative Arts, Design History and Material Culture. A prolific writer and scholar, Paul's research and publications are mostly concentrated in 2 areas: architecture and design in Britain and in Central Europe, primarily Hungary, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He has a particular interest in graphic design, interiors and print culture, although recent work has been concerned with public monuments and cultural history and an interest in émigrés and emigration. He's explored these in a number of publications, notably the 3 books, Britain and Hungary, Contacts in Art, Architecture and Design from 2000, 2001 and 2003. And recently, I've worked with Paul on an article which he wrote on Laszlo Perry and Frederick Antal, which was published in a special issue of the Visual Culture in Britain. He's particularly concerned with the relationship between contemporary theoretical and critical writings and actual objects. And we'll see this, I think, in some of the things that he has to say later. This dialectical relationship between text and things lies behind the selected writings of the English architect, designer E.W. Godwin, with whom he has edited a volume with Juliet Kinchin in 2005. So, introductions aside, our plan tonight is to provoke your curiosity about 4 really fascinating objects from the Cooper-Hewitt's collection. And these span the late 19th century to the early 20th century, and these are the 4 images of objects from the Cooper-Hewitt. So we have the Thonet brothers rocking chair, which is the earliest piece of design. We have a piece of woven jacquard by Christopher Dresser from the 1870s. We then have the William Henry Bradley poster from 1894 and the René Lalique, or a drawing for a René Lalique comb from the around 1900, 1904. The format of the evening is as follows: a brief introduction by myself, then Reggie will discuss the Thonet rocking chair. In particular, she'll consider Thonet within the context of the world's fairs, technological change, and the development and sort of beginnings of proto-modernity. Paul will concentrate on William Bradley. He'll locate his work within the context of graphic design at the end of the 19th century, as well as looking at the influence of Japanese design and innovations in colour lithography. So, returning us to the theme, modern times, and by way of conclusion, I'll then look at the two pieces of work, the piece by Dresser and the piece by Lalique. And what I want to do is to elaborate what I think is one of my key ideas around design in the late 19th into the 20th century, that although of course it's striving to be modern, it's also looking back to the past. It's Janus-faced, it looks backwards and forwards. So let's turn now and think about this period, this very interesting, fascinating moment at the turn of the 20th century, the cusp of this new century. The writer Marshall Berman captured this in a much-quoted essay about the experience of modernity, and I'm going to read you this quotation. It's quite a long one, but I think it really captures the essence of this moment. Quote, "The maelstrom of modern life has been fed from many sources, great discoveries in the physical sciences, changing our images of the universe and our place in it, the industrialization of production which transforms scientific knowledge into technology. It creates new human environments and destroys old ones. It speeds up the whole tempo of life, generates new forms of corporate power and class struggle, immense demographic upheavals, severing millions of people from their ancestral habits, hurtling them halfway across the world into new lives, rapid and often cataclysmic urban growth, systems of mass communication, dynamic in their development, enveloping and binding together the most diverse peoples and societies, increasingly powerful nations, bureaucratically structured and operated, constantly striving to expand their powers, mass social movements of people and peoples, challenging their political and economic rulers, striving to gain some control over their lives, finally bearing and driving all these people and institutions along an ever-expanding, drastically fluctuating capitalist world market." So, to think of that quote, to think of the extraordinary change to a lesser or greater degree, and we have to take care, of course, we're looking at design which is produced in four different Western countries. So they are different and they have different sort of historical context, different peculiarities, but nevertheless, technical innovation, communication, transport, manufacturing, phenomenal industrial development, new processes, new techniques, new markets, new modes of consumption, different ways of selling, huge population growth, migration, immigration, countryside to city, Europe to the USA, and the development of cities, New York, Paris, Vienna, London. So to consider London as an example, this is something that I've been working on recently in the book that I'm writing with Hazel Clark at Parsons. At the end of the 19th century, London was the capital city of an empire. It extended over a quarter of the land surface of the globe, and it comprised 20% of the population of England and Wales. By 1900, it was unquestionably the richest, largest, most populous city that the world had ever seen. The imperial city, immense, vast, endless. But defying popular conceptions, it was also a modern city, with 2/3 built in the previous 50 years, despite its plethora of historic streets, churches, and palaces. It was the largest built-up area in the world. The potential to be modern offered promise, but it also provoked anxiety. Quoting Karl Marx, Marshall Berman argued, quote, "To be modern is to be part of a universe in which," and this is the part from Marx, "all that is solid melts into air." Coupled with the belief that the 20th century would deliver progress and reform, there was a fear that this might go too far and undermine the established ways of things. A good example was the new woman, dressed in a mannish jacket, shortened skirt, and straw boater. She was a potent symbol of women's demands for political representation and a material expression of economic changes that propelled some women into the public world of work, away from the private sphere of home. The effects of this change, and as important, I think, the anticipation of the change, was widely felt, and inevitably this shaped design. But design was shaped by the past as well as the present. It bore traces of traditional aesthetic values, historical styles, methods of production, and consumer desires. By the turn of the century, fierce debate still raged regarding the impact of new technologies on the quality of design and manufacturing. New materials and methods of production had yielded great improvements. Again, focusing on London, consider the impact of Henry Dalton's Lambeth pottery in London. This produced sanitary and drainage pipes for the London sewerage system, and it contributed to the transformation of the capital's health. Yet at the same time, as an art pottery producer, Henry Dalton was in the vanguard, protesting about the poor quality of mass-produced ornamental and domestic products that also resonated with design reformers such as the South Kensington School, which included Christopher Dresser, as well as those associated with William Morris, the arts and crafts movement, and those who aligned with the cult of beauty and the aesthetic movement. Within this context, a burgeoning knowledge and understanding of Japanese design that followed the opening of Japan to the West in 1854 played a vital contribution as visitors such as Dresser studied Japanese art, textiles, ceramics, and other objects, and then published widely about them. But by 1900, the start of the new century, an awareness of Japan was consolidated in Western art and design circles. Equally, the socially reformist arts and crafts movement that had been hugely influential across Europe and the USA had by this date largely lost its radical socially utopian edge. However, the impact of its writers and its practitioners was diverse, far-reaching and profound. In particular, it proved influential with designers and manufacturers beyond England, in Glasgow, in Brussels, Vienna, Paris, New York, Darmstadt, Chicago, stimulating a new art, an Art Nouveau. So, within this context, I want to now turn and introduce Reggie. Reggie's going to take us on the next step of our journey through these modern times. Over to Reggie.
Hello.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to talk somewhat informally about the relationship of technology and the industrial arts. Cheryl has asked me to use this object as my lens. This is an object in the Cooper-Hewitt Museum. So I'll start with this object, and then I'll move forward in time and backward in time, looking at other objects in the Cooper-Hewitt collection and other objects in other collections as well. This is a rocking chair. What are we looking at, first of all? We're looking at a rocking chair made around 1860 by the Thonet factory in Austria, which was established in 1819 and is still in operation today in some form or another. The Thonet factory was an early producer of mass-produced furniture. They used laminated veneers and bent wood to introduce sturdy, lightweight, and inexpensive furniture that found a ready market in the booming economy of Vienna in the late 19th century. The founder was named Michael Thonet, and he was a master of scale economies. He reduced assembly costs by selecting woods based on their performance characteristics, and he used steam power to bend the woods. He eliminated all carving and reduced the number of components in each design, and introduced interchangeable parts. So some of this jargon and this lingo may sound familiar, and we can think of Thonet, in fact, as a precursor to Henry Ford in many respects. After 1853, Thonet turned the business over to his 5 sons, who responded to the challenges of the international market and grew the business internationally. These types of chairs were sold all over the world, and new glues for they were especially popular in the tropics because glue that went into conventional furniture did not tolerate tropical climates, and these bentwood technologies could tolerate these types of climates. So by the turn of the century, the Thonets really had built an international business by bending solid beechwood and using steam power and iron molds to create a whole array of these types of bentwood furniture. By 1904, the company employed some 25,000 workers in 60 factories and 52 offices and produced 6,000 pieces of furniture per day. A lot of furniture. Now, this furniture looks really old-fashioned to us when we look at it as members of the 21st century who are accustomed to the modernist look that Apple has introduced to us recently and helped to popularize recently. But what I want to do is to try to help you look at this chair and to look at some other late 19th century objects with a new eye. And I want to focus on the technology that's really visibly invisible. Because I think if we look at these objects from a technical perspective, we can understand what was modern about them and what viewers in the 19th century saw as modern when they went to the World's Fairs, for example, and saw this exhibit. Again, we look at this exhibit and we think, ew, look at all of the goop. But I think that as a historian, I look at this differently. I try to examine this type of display, which is from the 1867 Paris Exposition, and look at what was new and different and exciting about this material to the people the consumers and the producers of the time. This print is from the Metropolitan Museum of the Art. Metropolitan Museum of Art. Now, let's think a little bit about, backtrack a little bit. We're thinking about technology, but I also want you to think about the culture. And in order to understand the culture and the cultural context of the Thonet chair, we need to think about the notion of progress. The Victorians, that is, people who lived really from the period of Victoria's reign from 1837 to 1901, really believed in a predictable universe, an objective truth, and a stratified social order. This assumption was based on the notion of progress, which was an idea that esteemed science and technology as the peak of human achievement. You can see kind of the roots of some of our own modern sensibilities, our own contemporary sensibilities. The concept of progress in the late 19th century defined man-made goods as signs of human creativity and held that all quote-unquote civilized people had the right to enjoy these things. Westerners put European cultures at the pinnacle of their social pyramid, identifying industrialized nations as civilized in part because their citizens enjoyed a high level of material comfort. This was an era. Put yourself back in these shoes, and some of you who were born before 1960 will remember these times. This was an era when billowing smokestacks were a sign of something good, not a sign of environmental degradation. Again, you've got to wrap your head around this different mindset that these early modernists had. So billowing smokestacks, such we had here in New York City, we had in Philadelphia, my hometown, we had in Manchester, England, and Pittsburgh, in Pennsylvania, and Lyon, France. These were symbols of economic productivity. And the ownership of the things that those factories made, those textiles and those porcelains and those bentwood chairs, showed that a person was progressive or modern. So it's World's Fairs like this, which is Paris 1867, showed tourists that the variety of consumer products that were coming out of factories in United States, England, Germany, France, Australia, and Japan were symbols of modernity. You want to be modern, don't you? You want to have that cell phone today. And just as you want to have that cell phone or that iPad today, in the late 19th century, you wanted to have this kind of stuff to show that you were hip and with it. So I want to go back to this concept of the visibly invisible. We have, I'm again going to use the cell phone as an example, the iPhone as an example. Today we have been engendered with the notion that technology is associated with electronics, whether it's the microphone that I'm speaking into, the computer that I'm looking at, the cell phone, the iPad, the television. We associate technology with electronics. But in the 19th century, technology, first of all, didn't really exist as a word. But the word that referred to things technical, the words and the phrases that referred to things technical was the term industrial arts. And the industrial arts were the products of industry. And the products of industry represented technical virtuosity. Now, not all of these things were visible. For example, one of the high-tech industries of the 19th century was the synthetic organic chemical industry. This is a 1980 portrait in the Chemical Heritage Foundation collections in Philadelphia, showing an important moment that is important to everybody in this room who's wearing clothes, and we're all wearing clothes. This is William Henry Perkin discovering the synthetic way to produce mauve. And by doing this, he launched the modern chemical industry. He laid the foundation for modern chemical companies like BASF, ICI in Britain, DuPont here in the United States. So these types of technologies that you see Perkin depicted here in the middle, flanked by a capitalist and a worker or a practical man. There he is discovering this process. What's high tech here is the color and the dye itself. So we've got women in the late 19th century are, for the first time, ordinary consumers are able to have really bright colors that don't fade. This color that I'm wearing would not have been possible before Perkin's discoveries. It would not have been possible for me to have worn this type of product. So you've got a whole host of technologies that come out of the dye industry that are important and shape the material world. Another symbol of progress and another type of modern product in the 19th century was iron. We don't think of gilded iron as being modern, but this is a chair made in 1850, made here in the United States by the American Chair Company, designed by Thomas Warren. This is from the St. Louis Art Museum. What's modern about this? Well, in the United States, cast iron replaced wrought iron as the preferred metal after the Pennsylvania coal pits were discovered in the 1840s. And iron was the linchpin of 19th century industry. It was the Herculean stuff of steam engines, railroad tracks, and suspension bridges. was a versatile material that could also be formed into delicate objects for the parlor and for the porch. Now, if you look at this chair, it's an early example of a swivel chair. You probably have a swivel chair in your home or your office. And what's innovative about this is all of the wonderful decoration that's painted on the back of the object, but also the use of this very, very detailed wrought iron base and the use of these circles. They look like little circles. They're actually springs. These are early springs. The American chair company actually made railroad chairs and seats for railroad cars, and it adapted this technology to make this early swivel chair. So here we have another example of something that looks old-fashioned, but is really, for the moment, very, very high-tech. So it celebrates the cast iron by presenting the consumer with very, very intricately molded motifs out of cast iron. That's high-tech 1860 or 1850. I'm going to go through a few more examples. These vases are not in the Cooper-Hewitt collection. They're in another museum collection. They're vases that were made in a porcelain factory in Paris in 1867, and they are the earliest known examples. First of all, they're really big. They're about this big, much bigger than you would think. And then the earliest known examples of decal decoration. These are not hand-painted. They're only partially hand-painted. So they are the first examples of ceramics that have a transfer decoration applied to them. And again, the beauty is in the detail. These were exhibited at the Paris Fair in 1867. This is from the Cooper-Hewitt collection, and this is material here is glass. This is a vase made by the New England Glass Company in Cambridge, Massachusetts, between 1883 and 1888. It's a type of glass called amberina. And again, this looks old-fashioned. It looks kind of prissy to us. But to the 19th century viewer, this represented cutting-edge aesthetics. It represents cutting-edge aesthetics because of the transition from the gold base to the red font. And this was created by the using gold in the batch or the metal of the glass, and the top part was reheated, and when the glass was reheated, you got this brilliant red. It was very, very difficult to get this kind of red at this period in time. So again, another example of high Victorian high technology. So final example I want to leave you with is going into the 20th century. When we look at this object is a chair designed by Marcel Breuer in 1925, and it was manufactured around 1927 or 1928. It is in the Cooper-Hewitt collection. It's made of chrome-plated tubular steel and canvas, and it represents kind of the next step of the Thonet innovation in that it uses the latest material. These chairs are pretty ubiquitous today, much as like the Thonet chairs, these types of chairs using tubular steel, but at the time this was fairly innovative. It was fairly new. The process of making stainless steel was perfected between 1900 and 1920. And like other new materials such as vinyl, it thought to express the spirit of the time. It was a product of science and technology that was born in the chemist's laboratory and that was made with new quantity production equipment designed by professional engineers, making these materials ultra-modern. By the 1930s, Thonet, who never gave up on bentwood furniture, began making these types of chairs. So in conclusion, I want to end with one picture. Oops, not that one. Although that's pretty cool too, and I'll be happy to talk to you about it. with this picture from the Cooper-Hewitt Museum. This is a drawing of a salon in Vienna, Austria from 1872, as you can see. And I think this is a really wonderful picture that kind of gets to the heart of the idea of technology and progress, because here you see the Thonet chairs, the bentwood chairs, sitting along side by side, thickly, heavily upholstered chairs. And the whole feeling of the room is actually much like this room. It's really quite luxurious. It's carpeted, it's wallpapered, it's painted, it has thick drapes. It represents the epitome of luxury. And the luxury is reflected in the choice of materials, the choice of colors, and the juxtaposition of all of these rich motifs and the busyness, general busyness of the room, and the juxtapositioning of these different expressions of mass production. So, for example, you've got the overstuffed blue chairs next to the Thonet chairs. Both of those represent technical achievement. So, with that, I will end, and hopefully I will have opened your eyes to looking at this type of material in a new and different way. Thank you very much.
Thank you. While I just deal with the technical equipment here, which I'm very well trained for, I'd like to introduce Paul Sturton, who will talk about William Bradley and the art poster in America.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank everyone at the Cooper-Hewitt National Design Museum for inviting me to speak to you tonight, and indeed for holding this event, but especially Enid and Lester Morse for endowing this lecture series, which seems like an outstanding way of promoting an interest in the Cooper-Hewitt, just at a time when it's entering a new phase of its long and distinguished life, we hope. Well, what I'm going to be looking at today is one poster, and I'm really only going to look at 2 years in the 1890s, when many of the issues about graphic design, the poster, and commercial imperatives seemed to come into very sharp focus in America. And the poster I'm going to be looking at is this piece called The Blue Lady, or it's its popular term anyway, produced by Will Bradley for a new publication called The Chap Book. It was published in Chicago. And this poster appeared in August 1894. It's a lithograph in 3 colours on quite thin wove paper, as was typical of lithography. And indeed, lithography is one of these curious mediums that had been around for quite a long time, but it took certainly 60 or 70 years before its full potential was appreciated. It was largely developed in Germany in the 1790s, but it's not really till the second half of the 19th century that the potential for the lithograph to print in strong colours on a large scale were really appreciated, and the idea of the chromolithographic, basically the coloured poster, came into its own. Now, Bradley is very typical of many people who first took up poster design. They were not what we would call graphic designers, as in a modern, really 20th century term. They were mostly trained within the printing industry. They were jobbing printers. They would learn one or other aspect of the trade. And Bradley's quite interesting because he came up through a very traditional compositing and printing training. He was a typographer, as well as training as a bookbinder and various other aspects of the commercial world of everyday printing. But he had aspirations above being a simple printer. And that actually marks out one of his great decisions, which was to move to Chicago, one of the great centres of printing in the Midwest, and indeed to link himself with this expanding area of printing for high-quality books and magazines. Now, in a way, Bradley was part of a larger movement to reform the quality of printing, of books, magazines, advertisements. He was rather close to what we might think of nowadays as the English design reform movement, where everything had to be made better. The degeneration, the decline, what they very often thought was really the shame of industrialization, was that it had debased the products that we are surrounded by. And there was a movement really from the 1830s onwards to try and restore a sense of quality, and hopefully, in the case of William Morris at least, to bring back a link between the people who design and make things and also those who consume or use them. Now, in a way, working with publishers and printers put Bradley into the centre of one of the key elements that has already been mentioned about the modern world. Working in a collaborative manner in one of the great urban centres, in which design is only one part of a much larger network of production, sale, distribution, and consumption of goods. The designer is really only a tiny part of a much larger process. That's true to this day, despite what designers might say. Their role in the larger operation of the modern world remains relatively limited. But it's a key and important area because we're very much aware of it. Now, when Bradley moved into this, he didn't know where he was moving. He was still firmly set within the trade, and he was responding to commissions, being asked to produce illustrations, set type, or produce, in this case, a design advertising a new magazine. Now, it wasn't the first poster that Bradley had produced for the chapbook. Indeed, slightly earlier that year, he had produced his first poster, which is often described as the Twins for obvious reasons. In many respects, the Twins is a more experimental and more unusual design. It's more distinctive. Oh, I'm sorry, are we losing?
We've got one.
I'm sorry about that. The bulb may have gone on this side. I'm very sorry. I might have to describe some of these images to you over here. If you can get some idea, this will perhaps explain what I'm talking about. Perhaps because Bradley, who had lots of experience in the industry as an illustrator, was unused to making images on a large scale. I think the poster for the Twins is much more curious. It's a rather naive, very often a simple design, but in my view, it's much less part of the mainstream. Now, the Blue Lady is a much more sophisticated design, although it's only 2 or 3 months afterwards. And indeed, the Blue Lady reflects many of the current preoccupations of poster designers in America and in Europe. And this has led many commentators to trace the sources for Bradley's poster style to other more famous examples. Perhaps the most famous and obvious is Aubrey Beardsley. And Beardsley was certainly the most famous and sensationally popular designer in the English-speaking world in 1894. Comparing Bradley's Blue Lady and Beardsley's poster for the Avenue Theatre of March 1894 for the play A Comedy of Size, we can see many points of similarity. Extreme simplification of the forms and colours, which is, of course, ideal for lithographic printing. Printing process relies on working on large fields from a stone that transfers bold blocks of unmodulated colour onto the paper. But this encourages emphasis on the curious blocks in the design, decorative lines and contours that are obtained from this reduction of forms into blocks of colour, in which the silhouettes within bold fields of colour seem to take on almost an independent, abstract quality. You can see the effect of Beardsley's female figure set behind this field of green spots, or Bradley's rendering of the folds in the woman's coat into looping arabesques across the bottom of the picture, or the depiction of her skates hanging from the woman's left hand. Oddly broken up by the title, which may indicate either that Bradley was still a novice at designing on this scale with text, or possibly that someone else did the text and they weren't interested in the subtleties of his design. Bradley did not need to have seen Beardsley to achieve these effects. The problem of influence that most art and design historians are slaves to really means that we're often looking for sources when we don't have to find them. Bradley would already have seen many examples of the same source material that Beardsley was interested in. Americans didn't require Europeans to teach them about Japanese prints. It was an American who had first broken the trade blockade with the Tokugawa shogunate and opened Edo Japan up to contact with the West in the 1850s. There were plenty examples of Japanese prints in Chicago or New York, and the example that I'm showing you here is, of course, from the Cooper-Hewitt's own collection. This flattening of forms, the curious perspective, the tendency to stylize naturalistic elements like the wave breaking into decorative patterns, and the reduction of colors into a few key elements. Bradley could see that in Japanese prints just as easily as Beardsley could. In fact, when you look back at the Blue Lady, I think you might see just how far Bradley has taken this, and the extent to which obvious influences like Japanese woodblock prints are already well absorbed in his approach to pictorial design, so that it is now quite independent of its sources. In any case, the Beardsley is far too recent to have exerted a strong influence on Bradley's work. A better way of looking at this, I would suggest, is to explore the broader shifts in taste, style, and source material that was definitely underway in the early to mid-1890s, and of which Beardsley may have been at the centre, but he was only one part of a much larger shift. I'm thinking here of the arrival of the new art and design magazine, The Studio, which had appeared in April 1893. This is both the front cover on the left and a poster from 1895, both of which are by Beardsley, in his most Kelmscott-like manner, looking above all to William Morris's Kelmscott Press books. It would be difficult to overestimate the impact of The Studio on artists and, above all, craftspeople and designers throughout Europe and North America. The first issue carried articles on Aubrey Beardsley, William Morris, Whistler, European design. The second issue had the first article on Charles Rennie Mackintosh. As the editor of a design history journal, I'd like to get any of that material into my journal, but there's very little chance of having that kind of splash overnight. Within a few months, The Studio was the most widely read design and craft journal in the world, with correspondents all over Europe, North America, and in Japan. Very committed to the arts and crafts movement from the outset, The Studio had emphasized the role of printing and what would become known as the private press movement. Perfect for someone like Bradley, who emerged from the rising tradition of fine printing in the USA. Now, fine printing for book lovers, particularly lovers of literature and bibliophiles, was the market that the chapbook was aiming for. But unlike many small-scale projects, the publishers, Stone and Kimball, two undergraduates in Harvard who'd set it up just the year before, then moved to Chicago where they could consolidate their business. They wanted to place their new publishing house on a secure financial footing. The immediate inspiration for the new posters advertising the chapbook was not so much a rival publication, but one that certainly set the pace in marketing and advertising. This was Harper's New monthly magazine, which in April 1893 had embarked on an eye-catching advertising campaign with striking pictorial posters by Edward Penfield. A new poster and a new cover every month, all by Penfield, creating a strong pictorial identity for the magazine. This was the first one that was published, although there is an earlier one for March, which was probably Penfield's trial piece. In May, he changed direction, more closely emulating the effects of the French poster designer Jules Chéret, using a very effective technique known as crashi. Now, Chéret was largely responsible for inventing the large-scale pictorial poster. And he used a very ingenious effect in which small droplets of touche, which is this diluted form of grease, is sprayed onto the stone, giving you a series of mottled effects. I think if you look at the background to the poster Le Courrier Français, you'll notice that dotting technique and the very subtle tones and colours which are achieved through overlaying different material, different colour tints. Really, using little more than 5 colours, he was able to suggest a full range, a full palette of colours, and to give an effect of light, atmosphere and air moving round the main figure. Now, Penfield's woman is a lot less brassy than Jules Chéret's semi-clad woman, but the effects that Penfield is going for demonstrate the extent to which American designers could see the finest, most recent European posters either at second hand through the studio or indeed through rising collecting groups which were already appearing in America. Bradley's posters show great range, but curiously enough, they also show a tendency to fall back into the more earnest values of the private press movement. And I think you can see something of that in 2 of his later posters for the chapbook. The pinks on the left is quite completely conceived as a pictorial design, freestanding, using colour, form, decoration, and firmly impressing you with the name of the title of the publication, chapbook. The one on the left, known as The Poet and His Muse, seems to be rather like a rather earnest production by William Morris and the morally driven English design reformers who were very keen to emphasize a rather dreary black and white, emphasizing the moral qualities of traditional printing. Now, I think this is the schizophrenic aspect of Bradley's work around 1895, and he probably wasn't sure himself whether to move back into the fine printing private press movement or stick with the newly arrived poster tradition. There were other designers working for the chapbook, Hazenplug, Bragdon, and a range of others. So there was clearly many opportunities. Also, there was a lot of interest in it. The chapbook had already begun to advertise these same advertising posters for sale to collectors in cut-down collector's versions, which you could frame or mount in little books, very much following the tradition of the European art and advertising poster. Indeed, the 2 proprietors commissioned a new poster from Toulouse-Lautrec, and in the same issue of 1895, they said that they had 155 other European and American posters which could be purchased for sale by collectors. So there were opportunities, but Bradley, to me, seems to lose his nerve and turns his back on these new opportunities that the poster and advertising graphics offered. Bradley, his book from the following year, his own publication, is a rather uneasy balance between the large-scale, bold colours that can be achieved in using a lithographic press and the conventions of the really late medieval private press movement with its use of bold, simple florets that were used in traditional hand presswork. Now, Bradley, his book, is an interesting work, but I feel as if Bradley had the potential to move wholeheartedly into the new world of commercial graphics, advertising, and posters, which in a way we know dominated the 20th century. He did produce a few very interesting posters, but it tails off there, and he moves back into producing books, magazines, hand-printed, which he called chapbooks. I tend to think that was a loss of nerve and a failure, and in a way American graphics suffered because the organization of the industry in America moved apace through the creation of advertising agencies rather than being driven by designers. And in many respects, in Germany, if I can cite a very good example from the Cooper-Hewitt's own collection, designers and printers got a hold of the industry around 1906 and 1907 to develop a very distinctive and very effective form of advertising posters that moved to the mainstream of German culture. There was not, as a result, that split that developed in Britain and America between art and commerce, between progress very often and revivalism, and which I think is why Germany, for me, becomes one of the great centres of innovation, and why Britain and America remain caught in this quandary between two conflicting views. And I think really that Bradley is a case of the potential which America lost. I don't mean to end on a rather sad note, but I do think that America then reclaimed the central ground in advertising, but Bradley became a private press man. Okay, thank you.
Well, just a brief pause and while I find the place where I want to resume. Okay, well, thank you very much for your attention so far and the wonderful talks from Reggie and from Paul. I'd like to carry on now and look at the two other examples of design from the Cooper-Hewitt collection. And I want to begin by talking about Christopher Dresser. And maybe as a start to this, I can just talk about Dresser a little bit as a sort of an interesting case study about what it means to be a designer, or what it meant to be a designer in the 1850s through to the sort of 1870s, 1880s in Britain. There's a lot of debate in terms of how we should understand Christopher Dresser, how we make sense of his work. And if you look at the set of images which I'm reproducing here, you can see why that would be the case. You have something which looks very simple, very rectilinear on the top, your left. You have something on the top right which looks much more conventional. The two ceramic objects on the bottom of the image, of the bottom of the slide, are really quite bizarre. They certainly don't look as though they are to do with Western visual or material culture. In the center, you have an image which really references Japanese design. And I think that what we see with someone like Christopher Dresser is a man who is working as an industrial designer, or he's someone who is working across the range of manufacturing industries which require people to bring artistic and aesthetic skills to a mass-produced process. So with someone like Dresser, I think you see a sort of transitional character, someone who is of his time, but is also hinting to the future. and is also very questioning about the nature of visual and material culture. Now, this question of Dresser, about how we understand him and how we consider his work, is something that the Cooper-Hewitt addressed in the early part of in 2004, I think it was, with their exhibition Shock of the Old, Christopher Dresser. It was a marvellous exhibition which was very well designed. It showed the full range of Dresser's work, and it then moved to the V&A in London. But it did provoke a lot of debate about Dresser. It provoked debate about the exhibition itself, about how exhibitions work and how they characterise. They're part of the process of characterising design and designers in particular ways. Conventionally, Dresser has been interpreted as someone who was a proto-modernist. Typically, when you look at early writings about Dresser, particularly by Nicholas Pevsner, who was one of the pioneers of design history, he wrote a book called Pioneers of Modern Design, which some of you will know, in the mid-1930s. And in this, Pevsner makes a case for the idea of the story of design, which starts with William Morris and culminates in Walter Gropius. And the story is a sort of progressive one. It moves from designer to designer, from country to country, and it picks out examples of modern design, and it wants to explain how modern design developed. And one of the people that Pevsner looks at is Christopher Dresser. And the illustration that he puts in Pioneers of Modern Design is the one on the top left there. And he chooses this because it is really strikingly simple. But I think what we have to think about is that at the same time, Dresser is designing these other sorts of things. And this, I think, is where we learn, I think, by situating Dresser within the context of the second half of the Victorian period, the second half of the 19th century. The other thing I think about Dresser, and this maybe is something that we can think about at the end with some questions, is the particular media within which people are designing. I think that one of the interesting things is that certain types of material predispose themselves to, say, a rectilinear aesthetic, whereas other sorts of media and the place in which they are used really predisposes them to maybe something that is more decorative, more ornamental. Whether something is three-dimensional or two-dimensional, again, requires certain sorts of approaches. And certainly in the mid to late 19th century, it was inconceivable to not decorate a two-dimensional piece of textile, whereas it was more conceivable, I think, to have a cruet set which really emphasized those rectilinear lines. So I think that when we look at someone like Dresser and we think about the role of designers, we think about who they are, what they do, how they work. We need to think carefully about the media within which they work. We need to think about the manufacturing context, how they were employed. Were they in charge of the design process, or were they really producing drawings which were then adapted by manufacturers to suit the conditions of that manufacturing industry? Another interesting thing about Dresser is that he was prolific. He was an educator, he was a writer, reformer, and a designer. He worked for a range of companies, as I said. He worked for metalware manufacturers, for Elkington, Hewkin and Heath, James Dixon. He worked for textile manufacturers, James Ward in Halifax in the north of England, Warner's, Jeffrey & Co. And he worked for pottery manufacturers, Wedgwood, Minton, Linthorpe. He was the art director at Linthorpe Pottery, and the Linthorpe Pottery was established in Middlesbrough, which is very near where I'm based in the north of England. And last week I thought I would remind myself of the fantastic collection of Linthorpe art pottery, which is housed at the Dorman Museum in Middlesbrough. Many of you will have seen individual items or a handful of Linthorpe, but the Dorman Museum is just filled with this fantastic collection, which you can see here. And I think just by looking at this, you can see the point that I'm making about those sort of different styles of design, different approaches that Christopher Dresser took. So at Linthorpe, he was art director. At Elkington, he produced drawings for designs. One of the other things I think to think about in terms of Dresser is who was he designing for? He was designing, I think, for an upwardly mobile middle class who were able to consume these sorts of designs. These people were interested in the home beautiful, and they were advised about what was beautiful within the home by those domestic advice manuals and magazines, which developed enormously in the second half of the 19th century. So, Dresser, I think, is of his time, and I think his work looks forward and backward. It's modern and traditional. It engages with British motifs. It responds to modern design, to the reform initiatives that both Paul and Reggie have talked about. The desire in the mid-19th century to somehow call a halt to some of the aberrations of industrial design which had been produced by people who were little understood aesthetic principles, for example. And I think the South Kensington School was an initiator of that. So, modern design reform, but he was, first and foremost, he was a botanist. He knew about botanical drawing. He had studied botany. He, interestingly, also looked beyond Britain to Japan. So we have someone who's a very interesting individual. His approach to technology, I think, is typical of the period. He can design for industry, for mass-produced processes, but he also used hand processes. So Linthorpe, for example, combines both new sorts of technology in terms of moulding and casting ceramic bodies, but it also uses hand decorative processes to finish the surface of the ware. Cheap labour at the time meant that it was possible to employ people to undertake this sort of hand painting process. So, if we look carefully at this particular design from the Cooper-Hewitt collection, I think what you see here is a designer who is thinking very carefully about design principles for a two-dimensional surface. This is someone who is going back to the South Kensington principles that he's learned and contributed to the development of, particularly in relation to things like Owen Jones's Grammar of Ornament. So he understands about flattening, about ordering, about care in having small repeat patterns. In part, this is to do with the technology of the jacquard looms. At the same time, we've got someone who is referencing different cultures. He's referencing, I think, Greek and Roman culture, but he's also referencing Japan. He's knowledgeable about these countries, and he's knowledgeable because of that sense of design education, which is typical of the South Kensington group. The colour is restrained, the patterns are subtle. And this again references the time. It's to do with the development of more natural dyes, which comes through the arts and crafts movement, through Morris, but also comes through the aesthetic movement. It connects with other designers of the time. He is not one on his own. I think he's part of a sort of wider movement. I'm just going to, sorry, I want to go back there. Small repeat patterns, intricate variegated designs. In a sense, I think when you look at something like Dresser's work, you have to think of it within the times. You have to think of it as being representative of a particular culture, a particular economy, and the technologies of the period. So let's move from Dresser, so this is the 1870s, and think about René Lalique at the early part of the 20th century. I'm interested in what Paul said about the 1890s being a sort of pivotal point, and I think there is something in that. And again, maybe we can think across the piece when we have some discussion at the end. I think that moment in the 1890s when designers began to some extent, they began to shake off the past. They began to think more in terms of the future. So we can see Dresser and Lalique as part of a continuum, particularly in relation to their approach to flora and fauna and materials to some extent. But I think that with Lalique, we see someone who I think is taking a step beyond. He's a step beyond his time. To some extent, it is new. Interestingly, when we look at these pieces, these exquisite pieces of jewellery and hair decoration from Lalique, I think we can see someone again who's looking to Japan. He's knowledgeable about Japanese design. Again, as Paul said, American designers knew of Japan. French designers were very knowledgeable too. When you look at these, you see here is someone who is really thinking afresh, thinking anew. these objects were designed for a particular clientele, again, a different market. They were for the elaborate coiffures of fin de siècle hostesses. His palette resonates really with the delicate, subtle shades of silk, of velvet, of chiffon that was worn by these women within their homes and in public. These are the women of the Gilded Age, of the Belle Époque. The colours that they like, I think, are very interesting, thinking of Reggie's comments about colour. Here we have a shifting palette. The colours are moonstone, they're lilac, eau de Nil, cream, delicate rose, warm, soft yellows. They're very subtle, they're very understated. Interestingly, Lalique is again trained within the context of the arts and crafts movement, but he's also classically trained within France at the École des Beaux Arts Décoratifs. He was trained in England for a short period, and then knew of the South Kensington group and some of the principles of design from South Kensington. But when he goes back to Paris, he begins then to develop this new, more light approach, I think, to design. His approach to jewellery, just from looking at these, is highly original. His approach to nature, I think, is very questioning. He's interested in the sort of the small things. He's not just concerned with the established, grandiose, exceptional things. He's looking at the ordinary. So mistletoe, sycamore seeds, viburnum flowers, swallows, dragons and bees. He looks carefully at these things. Like Dresser, in some ways, there are some comparisons in that he was a designer who worked for different companies. So he worked for Boucheron and Cartier and Destape. And then in the 1880s, in the mid-1880s, after Destape died, he took over his shop. So let's look a little bit more carefully at the design which is in the Cooper-Hewitt collection. Again, it's closely observed nature. The colour is very subtle. It's informed again by Japanese design. There's a sense of linearity, of asymmetry. And I think this sense of asymmetry is something that you see increasingly in the Art Nouveau movement. Unlike Dresser's designs, Lalique his carved and combed jewels were produced for a wealthy elite. It was an artistic market, and they had social, cultural, and economic capital to wear them. I think reflecting upon these two designers, thinking of the 1870s through to the early part of the 20th century, I think we can see a change. We can, although I started out by questioning the sort of Pevsner's approach, the Pevsnerian analysis of design, I think that we can see with Lalique there is a sense of the new century dawning, a new sort of thinking about how you approach very simple things like a hair comb. So thank you very much. Thank you. Well, the next stage of the evening's proceedings is that I'm going to sum up, I'm going to pick out some of the points that seem to me to be particularly interesting, but I'm not going to take a great deal of time doing that, because I think it would be very interesting to hear what you have to say and to take any questions from the floor. I think that there have been a number of themes that have run through the different talks and which tie the objects together. And it must be almost a year ago now when I was speaking to the staff at the Cooper-Hewitt about which objects we should choose. And you can imagine the sort of pleasure that I would have to be part of that process, to have some input into what we would be looking at. And I tried to help to choose things that were different media, graphics, textiles, poster, furniture design. But I also wanted to choose things which would help to provoke some discussion, to make us think differently about objects. And I think but also something which would give us something to hang the talk around. I think that modern times was a good idea in that what we see with all of these things are elements of modernity, elements of tradition. We see Western countries coming to terms with new technologies, changing markets, a whole sort of plethora of things. thinking of Reggie's title, Visibly Invisible, how do we, poses the question, how do we interpret objects? How do we make sense of them? What we see is just the thing itself, but through research and through reading and understanding, we can begin to get some sense of the way that things were made. And what was clear from the Thonet furniture is that technology played a vital part. And in some ways, I think that the bentwood it's a sort of obvious example of new technology. But I was very struck by Reggie's last slide when she talked about the upholstered furniture, the room, the interior, which was filled with things which demonstrated technological change and development. So things looked old-fashioned, but as Reggie said, they were high-tech. They were of their time. I think one of the things that struck me in both Paul and Reggie's talk was the idea of the spirit of the times, the spirit of the age. And I think that, you know, when we come to look at these as things as curators and designers and design historians, we have to think, you know, to what extent and how do these things represent the spirit of the age? I think what's interesting from Paul's talk was this tension between graphic design, the poster, and commercial imperatives. Interestingly, that the center of these sort of new innovations was Chicago in the 1890s. And I was struck by particularly the technology of lithography. Again, Reggie looked at lithography when she looked at the decals which were used in the pottery industry. So interesting to think about two different media and the impact of two different technologies on those media. I think another common theme for all of us was the role of the designer. You know, what do designers do? How much control do they have? Are they single sort of authorial figures who really have control? Or, as I think is more the case, they're part of a system of production, consumption, mediation. They have to learn, I think, many skills. They're not people who just stand aside and create. They have to roll their sleeves up and get stuck in. I think that the relationship between technology and craft is something else that has come through in these talks. And as part of that is modernity and tradition. I hesitate to use these sort of binary oppositions, but I think they are quite useful sometimes to help us to sort of get a handle on what we're looking at. I think the final thing to say is that we've looked at design from 4 different countries, and what is interesting is to think about the similarities and the differences, to think about, you know, what it meant to be a designer working in Paris in 1900 or a designer in Middlesbrough, you know, which is really, Middlesbrough is akin to, say, Manchester, except smaller, you know, lots and lots of industry, grime and dirt. Not at all being on one of the best French streets selling your beautiful, exquisite jewellery. So, I think I've probably said enough, and I would like now to open up the floor for any questions or observations for myself and the panellists. Okay.
Going to the ladies' room a minute ago as we're walking down this hallway, there are multiple phone booths which are on the street. And in one is a very simple old telephone, probably 1940 maybe. Mm-hmm. Yes. And the next is the iconic 1970s big box payphone. And the juxtaposition of the two is quite interesting, and even the fact that they still exist. Don't we use that room or do that? Or are they here as vestiges of sort of looking at, you know, design through the phone? But it's right there as you're walking out. I encourage you to.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Does anyone have any other
Question. How is the, I don't want to say necessarily the market, but just the intrigue perhaps, or the interest in design from the modern times right now in comparison with contemporary design? Is there a place for it, or is it strictly to museums now? Is invested in quite as much.
Sorry, so can I just, so the idea of the modern.
Right, the modern as opposed to contemporary.
Okay. Do you have any thoughts, colleagues?
Can you repeat the question?
Could you repeat the question in the microphone?
I guess just simply, what is the demand and the interest in design from and design objects from the modern era right now?
So, I mean, if I've understood correctly, it's really about the kinds of products of the period we were looking at and whether they're still collected and part of the market.
Right. Is it something that's only going to be found in a museum, or only are there, in Sotheby's, let's say, in some sort of auction that very few people attend?
No, not at all. Oddly enough, possibly with the exception of the Lalique and a couple of other items, almost everything that I showed you could pick up for a few $100s at the most. I think quite interestingly, and I'm trying to bring this out at the time, that while we tend to think of a lot of these posters as commercial exercises, they were already being collected by connoisseurs and print collectors in the 1890s. And posters are a slightly curious phenomenon in that, something which almost from the moment of their birth as a commercial medium, which is really, I mean, you can get early examples of it, but the lithographic poster comes into its own in the 1880s. And by 1890, there are collectors' clubs, dealers, and such like. So from the very beginning, it was part of it. But in terms of the market, posters are not so unlike Thonet, but most of these posters were produced in several hundred copies. They're not rare. And because many of them were collected and admired at the time, many of them are in really good condition. Now, those that went on billboards and then had another poster painted on top, pasted on top, well, you still see them occasionally, but they're a right mess. But actually, a lot of the scholarship on posters comes from collectors and dealers rather than museum curators or academics like myself. I'm embarrassed to admit that the really fine detailed scholarship usually comes from dealers who have to go out and find this stuff and work out the precise information regarding its production, and very often if it was reprinted and what size it was originally, because they appear in lots of different versions. I think Reg, you might have something to say about Thonet in that, but
well, I regularly get inquiries not about Thonet but about of my first book, which was on the history of ceramics and glass. And was published 11 years ago, and it has a large part of it is devoted to Victorian and modern design. And I regularly get queries from collectors who say, my grandmother's dinner set, it's modern design, it's produced by such and such a company, can you help me with this? And I kind of want to pull out my hair, because sometimes the questions that they're asking, they're of interest to them as collectors and them because of the piece belonged to the family, but they're not, they want to know how many were made, for example, and it's kind of impossible to tell them that. And they tend to fetishize on these, how many patterns did the Sebring Pottery Company make in 1936? But the point is that I think that there are many specialized collectors groups for all of these different product categories that we've discussed. So I don't keep tab of them, but I've seen enough of them, I've glimpsed enough of them to say that there is a prosperous trade in these types of materials.
Thank you. Can I'll take your question in a minute. I just wanted to add one final thing to that, and that is that I think it's interesting the way that there are often revivals of these styles and approaches, so that in the 20th century, if you look at the history of the poster, you will see that in the 1960s, for example, there was certainly a revival in Art Nouveau poster design. And subsequently, say in relation to ceramics, someone like Clarice Cliff, who I've worked on, there are various, certainly in Britain, there are various sort of they're sort of cooks, television cooks who have their own ceramic ranges. And I frequently see their ceramics and I think, well, that, of course, is just like Clarice Cliff, or it's, you know, so I think there's a sort of currency in the visual vocabulary that is ongoing. So you wanted to ask a question.
I was wondering what you think the digital influence will be on the quality of posters.
Well, like most new technologies, it takes quite a while to become embedded, or and also to develop its own intrinsic qualities. Let's say the example I was using with lithography was almost 70 years old before people decided to make large-scale posters with it, and yet it seems invented to make large-scale color posters. Digital technology, as many people point out, is still kind of rooted in the pre-digital world. That they're using it, but the designers are thinking in terms that they had developed when they were being trained pre-digitally. I think nowadays you'll be getting designers emerging who are, I suppose what we'd call them now, born digital. And they're the ones who might well rethink it. But I have to say, I'm not a practitioner, and I tend to I try and look closely, but I can't look from the inside, from the actual making of things. And my experience comes, or my knowledge comes from speaking to people who design, mostly graphic design, and they agonize over this problem. Will new technology transform it? Will their skills be redundant? Will their students be better at it than they are, which is frequently the case? Because new technologies cause as many problems as they offer opportunities. And I think digital's a classic example of that. In most areas of photography, it's already transformed it. In graphic design, it's still in the process. Most graphic designers are trained not with a pencil or any kind of paper or even a camera nowadays. It's all on a computer. They need never see a piece of paper.
I have a question over there.
I have a question about the role of the designer versus the inventor. Because things like the blown glass or the lithograph, or Hugh Robertson, the Chelsea ceramic work, and were the consumers, when they got these objects, did they look at them as, here's a new design, or here's a new invention? And so often I think that retroactively we can label these people who are much more obsessed with the technology as designers, when often that was either second or the Tufted furniture from Thonet. Yeah. And I was wondering if you could discuss a little bit about the idea of the inventor versus the idea of the designer in this time period.
Reggie, that sounds like a question for you.
Yeah, I didn't have a chance to elaborate on that very important point. If I was to give this talk in an hour-long lecture, I would have talked about the practical man. And that way, our talks would have really dovetailed very nicely. Because in the 19th century, the words designer was not used as frequently as the word practical man. So if you were setting up a glassworks, you would put together a capitalist, someone who had money, and a practical man, that is someone who was trained in an apprenticeship program, worked his way up through the factory or her way up through a seamstress type situation, and they would put together their skills. And if you look at the literature of the time, those words inventor and designer aren't even in the kind of general discussion. It's a whole different set of language that is being used. So I think to answer your question, designer and inventor really aren't even on the wavelength of the folks at that point in time. They're thinking differently. And in order to explain that, you really need more than 20 minutes. So I think you're on track, though, with asking that question.
Just following up on that
Yeah.
question and point.
Yeah.
Dresser, for example, wasn't just a designer. He attempted to develop his own brand. And he
Yeah.
was very active in putting his own name on his products. And in fact, in the retail market as well as the design market, was he the only one doing that? Were others trying to develop that type of business model in Is that something that carried on?
Well, I think if you think the ceramic industry is a very good example, actually, of an industry where you find the sort of, the stamping of manufacturers had been going on from, way before.
That's not design, that's manufacturing.
But you had initials which would signify a particular, the person who would have done the painting, for example, the painted surface. And, you'll see often the bottom of a pot will have a number of different initials on. But I take your point about the idea of stamping a particular... I don't know if I would say that Dresser was the first person to do that.
Well, you might argue that Wedgwood created a brand in the 18th century, even though he didn't call it a brand.
And but interestingly, he didn't actually design them himself.
No, he didn't. I would say that if you were to pick the period 1850 to 1900, and you put Dresser... Was Dresser typical, I think, I think Dresser is atypical. I think that the practical man is the apprentice-trained practical man who works in one industry or a series of related industries is actually more typical than someone like Dresser, who sees himself as a reformer and a tastemaker. I think he's more unusual, and he's more, some respects, more forward-looking than typical, and so therefore we revere his products because they resonate with us in our tastes, whereas the tchotchkes like this might not, what the practical man designed, might not resonate with us, so we tend to look at the majority of the people less than the tastemakers and the taste shapers than people like Dresser.
I think that's probably true, and I think it's interesting when you look at someone like Dresser that it's in the context of design reform. So it's someone sort of consciously taking a stand against what he sees as the sort of dominant, poor quality of design.
Right. Right.
Oh. One question. Yeah, yes.
I'm Alan Rosenberg. I have a thought and a question about the Thonet or Thonet chair and the settee. It's an extremely interesting phenomenon in late 19th and 20th century design. I believe it was first produced in the 1860s or 70s.
Mm-hmm.
Then it was revived.
Yes.
In the Art Nouveau period.
Yes.
As something that was appropriate to the Art Nouveau aesthetic.
Yes.
Then it was revived again in the 1925 exhibition. When Le Corbusier used it in his interior. That was exhibited at the 1925 Art Deco exposition. And then in the post-war period, it became a ubiquitous fixture in post-war modern revival design interiors.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see it as something that continues to be a viable design object? And do you have any thoughts about it as something that is something that has persisted over almost, let's say, 150 years or so?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I was hinting at my thoughts about, my deeper thoughts about the Thonet chairs when I said that Thonet really foreshadowed Henry Ford. I think it's a brilliant, it's really an intriguing, the rocking chair and the bentwood chairs generally from the mid-19th century are intriguing to me because of the many innovations that the factory adopted which foreshadow mass production as it was developed here in the United States. So I think as a historian of industry and manufacturing, I think it's a category of object that we need to learn more about. We need to, there were some really great studies done on Thonet in the 1970s, but I would be intrigued to revisit asking more contemporary questions. So, so that would be my answer to your question.
Thank you. I think we now have to call a close to the event, but to the wonderful discussion. Thank you very much for your contributions. I'm sure that there's much more to be said.